Hello, my name is Gizem Güler Nakıp. I would like to present our research, Modern Architecture of the Second Half of the 20th Century in Local Context, Comparative Approach on Example of Housing Estates in Izmir, Turkey, and Tuhi, Poland, prepared with my PhD supervisor, Magdalena Żmudzińska, Nowak. I would like to briefly introduce the study. The housing of the modernism period has been adapted, progressed, and changed in local contexts by creating variations depending on local conditions. Therefore, discussing the modernist architectural heritage requires an approach that combines universal and local guidelines. In this study, the acceptance and development of modernism in the local context are comparatively analyzed using examples of selected multi-story houses, housing estates, and urban layouts in the second half of the 20th century from two different industrial and high-density regions, from Turkey and Poland. The aim of this study is to enrich the knowledge of the architectural heritage of the second half of the 20th century modernism and to develop a comparative method for their analysis. The research presented here is a form of a pilot study that aims to develop the adopted comparative research methodology for further studies. This study includes three steps. The first is presenting the theoretical background of the subject. The second is explaining the methods and materials, and the third is conducting the comparative analysis in the local context. The research questions are, what are the features of the housing estate architecture of the 20th century of the modern movement? How have they been affected by local contexts? How and from what aspects can housing architecture be analyzed comparatively? What are the similarities and differences in local contexts? If we talk about the theoretical background, we will first focus on modern housing estates in general. CIAM, which focused on whole areas of architecture, was influential in disseminating the modern movement to all geographies. Its ideas and decisions influencing the development of architecture and urban planning were later implemented in housing estate projects worldwide. As a result of CIAM-4, which established the functional city guidelines for urban planning, the main assumptions of housing estates were formulated in the Athens Charter of 1943. The period after the 1950s corresponded to the reorganization and development of the urban area, and 1960s were the spread of housing estates parallel to CIAM principles. In 1972, the collapse of the Pruitt-Igoe urban residential area was an indication of the end of large panel application in Western countries and the symbolic end of the period of modernism. For the comparative analysis, it's essential to pursue the developments in the backgrounds of these areas in the historical process. With the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, there was a significant structural change in urbanization. The 1930s was a period when the country met with modern architecture. After the Second World War, social mobility increased, a new culture of life emerged due to migration, and the number of civil servants and workers' population who tend to live in apartments has increased. The 1950s was an important breaking point with the liberal policies developed with foreign connections. The period was universalist and rationalist. The condominium ownership law adopted in 1965 is the most important breaking point in the increase in apartment buildings. In the 1965 and 1970s, cities began to intensify. In the 1980s, new developments were experienced, large-scale production forms began to be seen, and the problem of an insufficient number of houses and increasing slum areas were tried to be solved with housing estate approach. After the First World War, the Polish state regained its independence. Following Second World War, Poland state became the Polish People's Republic and attended with the formed group of communist nations. The period between 1945-1949 was the modernist thoughts of the pre-war period continued in architecture, and between 1950 and 1956 was replaced by socialist realism. After the end of the socialist realist period, architecture returned to modernity and the avant-garde. This period was called the thaw because of the architect's freedom despite the prevailing political conditions. Architecture in the late 1960s and 70s was utilitarian and economic. Industrial and rapid methods were needed to solve the housing problem. Large housing estate production reached high levels in 1970 and was considered a means of social transformation and better living conditions. This study uses the comparison method to investigate the cases systematically. It's a scientific method that compares specific cases with each other to reach further conclusions. It focused on the mixed method. A dominant qualitative study is supplemented by a quantitative study to establish the background. One of the basic and critical issues for applying the comparative study is case selection. Izmir, the city with the third largest population in Turkey, is one of the leading cities in terms of historical, economic, and sociocultural aspects. Transformations throughout history and housing developments in Izmir have been parallel with Turkey in general. Tuhi is a city in the Upper Silesia region and industrial area in southern Poland. Change in borders, political transformations, and the economy have been influential in the architecture and urban planning of this region. The example of Tuhi is a mirror illustrating the transformations in the respective periods. As Azarian mentioned, every comparative study starts with a meaningful assumption that the selected cases are comparable. According to initial assumption, while the scale and size of the agglomeration and functions of the areas are similar, there are differences in the two sides' historical, political, and cultural backgrounds. The thesis of the study is that these similarities and differences in condition have shaped the specificity of modernist architecture in local contexts, which manifests itself visibly in residential areas of cities. In the sample selection of this study, which advocates using inductive method in comparative case analysis, the first focus is to determine the appropriate representative cases for further study. The first representative case was chosen from Izmir with reference to post-1980, a major breaking point with new developments, material technologies, production, and accessibility. Then, the most similar case design, which was one of Gering's 9 case selection techniques, was used for the second case. This method is one of the oldest accepted qualitative analysis techniques on the basis of Mill's study in 1834. The second site that can complement the first was determined from Tuhi. The components that the second site is similar to the first selected site according to the first assumptions were determined in terms of social and architectural and urban aspects. The method of the study consists of two main stages, the data collection process and the documentation and comparative analysis. The first stage consists of a theoretical study and on-site research. The second stage includes the transfer and organization of data. The analysis of selected sites includes urban and architectural scales. Urban scale analysis include location in the city, character and natural features of the surrounding area, site layout, public spaces and greenery. Architectural scale analysis include form, scale and proportion of buildings, plan layouts, articulation of facades, details and materials. I would like to briefly talk about the urban and architectural scale inferences we obtained as a result of the comparison. Emlak Bank Atakent houses located in Izmir is the sixth stage of the Emlak Bank housing estate project starting from 1969 in 9 states. Housing Estate A, located in Tuhi, the first project of the new city, was built when the socialist realism style was dominant. The current housing estates and their urban layouts in two different local contexts are quite diverse. They were influenced by the structural transformations in the process and created their own housing identities. Both sites are compact complexes and were designed with a holistic planning approach. We can observe that the factors referencing the Athens Charter were considered in the design of the residential areas of both sites. The use of open space and greenery has had the effect of improving living conditions. Their characteristic features include representative main squares, communication access, natural features, the structure of complexes, and recreational areas. In both sites, simple design, clear forms, rhythmic openings, and horizontal vertical lines were used. Functionality was prioritized, and they were designed to be a tool suitable for living conditions. They have a rationalist, functionalist, and national design styles. On the other hand, these inferences are drawn from two sites built at completely different times. The selected sites' construction dates corresponded to Turkey's rapid modernization and Poland's social realism periods. Despite the important housing estate examples in Izmir, it's very difficult to come across such a compactly designed site before 1980, but we can observe a site in Tuhi in the 1950s. This, in fact, stands out as proof of architecture and ideological approach that is mainly influenced by political and economic transformations and legal regulations depending on different local conditions. In conclusion, despite all these variables, this comparison reveals the potential and current complexity of the modernist housing estate heritage. The comparative analysis and research methods enabled the interpretation of the effects of heritage in the context of local conditions. It allowed us to achieve differing outputs while keeping the initial assumptions. The result is that the process operates differently according to local variables despite generalizing the similar contexts. The method presented in this study has the potential to be developed in further research. Comparative inferences will define local values and strengthen discussion in the international context. Here are our references, and continues here. Thank you for your attention.